The wind shook the old windows of Harroway Manor, making the glass shake in their old frames. The Yorkshire Dales had always been a wild and cold region, but tonight's winter storm appeared determined to wipe out even the memory of warmth from the hills. Edward Harroway sat by himself beside the fire, which was really just a dying red glow hiding behind the iron grate. Shadows spread long and deep across the stone floor, climbing the peeling wallpaper and bringing back bad memories. He pulled the ancient plaid blanket tightly around his slender shoulders. His bones hurt all over, and each ache was a reminder of a life that was once full and now empty. The manor was so cold that the breath coming from his lips curled like mist in the air. It was so frigid that he wondered whether he would ever feel his hands again. But the silence was worse than the cold. That was the true penalty. There was silence as thick as the dust on every letter, portrait, and drawer that had been sealed since the world had carried on without him. It wasn't always like this at the manor. Edward shut his eyes and tried to remember the sounds that used to fill these rooms. His father's loud, severe chuckle, his mother's singing as she arranged wildflowers, and the sound of small feet running down the hall. Now they're all gone, like the smell of old wood smoke that has faded into the walls and flooring. When the wind howled, he imagined he could still hear them crying to him from a time before the debts, the litigation, and the lands had been sold off one by one. The wind was exceptionally cruel tonight, howling over the eaves and roaring down the chimney, making sparks fly everywhere. He poured some tea that was chilly, weak, and not much more than water into a chipped porcelain cup. He shook his fingers as he picked it up and stared into the hearth, as if he thought answers would surface in the coals. He instantly and clearly remembered another night from a long time ago. He was probably no older than 8. At the time, there was also a blizzard so bad that his father told everyone to stay inside the manor. But Edward, who was as headstrong as a young horse, had gone outside to chase a dog that wasn't even his. He was lost, blinded by the snow, and kept walking deeper into the fields until he couldn't see the lights of the manor anymore. His boots were full with ice. He remembered yelling as the world got white, quiet, and unending, and the fear grew. Then, out of nowhere, a stranger showed in. He could have been a shepherd or just a passing farmhand. He never found out. The stranger had wrapped Edward in his own coat, taken him home, and disappeared before anyone could thank him. The remembrance brought with it a weird aching, as if that kindness had never really left him. As he looked into the flames, he heard a strange sound coming from underneath the wind. It was a slow, heavy thumping, like a heartbeat in the dark. Edward's body tightened, and all of his senses were on edge. The manor was far away from any roads, and in this weather, even the most desperate traveler would look for safety somewhere else. But the music kept going, getting louder and booming across the long driveway and the fields that were frozen. He put down the teacup and tried hard to hear. The pounding was clear now. Heavy hooves were coming up to the manor gates. For a second, he felt panic in his chest. Maybe thieves, or something worse. He grabbed the antique shotgun that was leaning against the fireplace, even though he knew it might blow up in his hands instead of firing correctly. Still, he held onto it tightly, his knuckles turning white against the barrel. The noise got closer, then stopped, and the quiet was so loud in his ears that it hurt. He held his breath and waited, his muscles tense. There was nothing but the wind and the pounding of his own heart. Then he heard another sound, a quiet, frantic whinny that the storm carried. Not just one, but several, soaring and shaking. It made his skin crawl. Horses are out in this storm, far from shelter? It was crazy. For a minute, his old instinct kicked in, to close the door, lock the windows, and pretend he hadn't heard anything. The memory of the shepherd stayed with him, and something deeper and older made him get up. He walked down the hallway, his footsteps muffled by the aged rugs, past pictures whose eyes silently judged him. He stopped at the door and felt the cold creep through the crevices like icy fingers. He put his ear to the wood. On the other side, something big moved, and he could hear it breathing, heavy, ragged, and tired. Then there was another whinny, followed by a gentle, trembling moan that sounded almost like a person in pain. Edward's hand was close to the clasp. He could see the headlines, "Mad Old Harroway Freezes to Death While Letting Wild Animals Into His House." He almost laughed, but the storm swallowed it up. He took a big breath and pulled the bolt out. The wind pushed the door open, and it slammed against the wall. Snow fell in ghostly sheets, and for a moment, Edward saw nothing but white. Then, out of the dark, came the biggest horse he had ever seen. It was jet black, with a mane that whipped in the wind, eyes that were wild but smart, and a ferocious inner fire that made it shine. 3 smaller forms were gathered behind it, shivering and covered in ice. They were foals. The black stallion stood in front of them to defend them. Its huge body shook with tiredness, yet it was still strong and unbreakable. Edward looked, torn between admiration and incredulity, his shotgun forgotten at his side. In the middle of the storm, fate had come knocking on his door. He halted, with the storm screaming behind him and memories and terror fighting inside him. Edward Harroway then stepped aside, almost against his will, and held the door wide open. As soon as the door opened wide, the blizzard seemed to shout with victory, sending snow and wind flying into the manor's entrance hall. Edward staggered back, blinking through the white rage. The black horse, Obsidian, pushed forward, lowering his huge head to get through the old door. For a moment, Edward believed the thing may trample him. Then the stallion stopped, its muscles tense and its breath steaming in the cold air. Obsidian's dark eyes were fixed on Edward's. They were wide and glassy, but they were also burning with something that wouldn't go away. Edward kept his position, his boots planted firmly on the flagstone and his shotgun hanging loosely in one hand. He could sense the animal's dread, yearning, and strong want to live. 3 yearlings huddled together in the swirling snow behind Obsidian. Their small bodies shook violently, and their eyes were big and begging in the dim light. Edward's survival instinct shouted in his chest for a moment. "Close the door, you idiot! Before you condemn yourself too, let them take care of themselves." But when he saw those shaking foals, whose slender legs could hardly hold them up, he remembered something from a long time ago, his own snowstorm. Lost, hopeless, waiting for help that seemed impossible. The man who had found him in the rain, a stranger who had offered him warmth when no one else would. The previous debt hurt Edward's heart. He chose in silence, opening the door wider and inviting. Obsidian paused for a moment to shake the snow from his huge mane. Edward's voice came out of his throat in a low, scratchy way that showed he hadn't used it in a long time. "Then come in. Hurry up before you get too cold out there." Obsidian snorted, as if he knew, and carefully stepped over the threshold like a king. The floor creaked when he walked on it. For a while, Edward was afraid the ancient boards might break, but the stallion advanced slowly, with each step well planned, and its hooves clicked like thunder on stone. The foals came in after that, tripping over each other and falling in a messy heap just inside the door. Edward grunted as he shoved the heavy door shut, then dropped the shotgun and ran to block it from the wind. He turned around and saw that his large entrance hall, which had previously been the venue of countless family gatherings and fancy balls, had now become a temporary stable. The snow that had melted poured steadily down the tiles, making puddles around the animals. The sides of the foals' bodies were shaking with tiredness, and their eyes were fluttering in terror and relief. He crouched down next to the tiniest one, a dun-colored filly whose legs shook a lot. There was ice in her fur. Edward fumbled with his scarf and tried to put it around her neck. "There, girl. You're safe now. Take a breath, okay?" Obsidian kept a careful eye on him, lowering his head and twitching his tail. Edward looked the stallion in the eye, attempting to seem cool and in charge even though his hands were shaking. "Take it easy, big guy. I won't hurt them. I won't hurt you." The horse didn't back down. Instead, he looked to be judging every motion Edward made, his nose twitching as if he were trying to remember his fragrance. For a long time, the man and the beast looked at each other. They were both survivors with scars that no one else could see. Edward, who was shaking, hurried to gather up all the old blankets and horse rugs he could find in the manor. He pulled a bundle from the mudroom. It smelled old, but it was still useful, so he spread it out by the dying fire. He had to cajole them a little, but he got the foals to lie down close together. As he nestled them in, their tiny breaths made a mist that mixed with his own. He went to Obsidian and gave him a handful of the valuable oats he had kept for eventualities. The stallion looked at the meal, then at Edward, and then, slowly, accepted the grain from his open hand. Edward was surprised by how warm the animal's breath was. It made him flinch, but he stayed calm. Now that the animals were safe, the adrenaline started to wear off and the cold set in. Edward rushed to stoke the fire, using the last of his kindling to try to bring it back to life. The storm's rage made the old bones of the house shake, and a shutter banged open somewhere in the distance. The next hour went by in a flash. Edward did what he could to make the new people feel better and warmer. He rubbed the foals dry and looked for extra food. He observed as Obsidian walked around the chamber, sniffing the air and quietly scraping his hooves on the stone. Even though he was big, the black stallion was careful not to step on the smaller animals or Edward. Edward would sometimes talk out loud, as if the horses could hear him. "You chose a bad night to come over. I don't have much, but I'll give you what I do have." Hearing his own words echo in the empty house made him almost giggle. He was so used to being quiet that even the sound of his own words felt weird. The horses didn't answer, but the foal's eyes followed him everywhere he went, and Obsidian never lost sight of him. At some point, they all got too tired. The foals fell asleep, wrapped in Edward's old comforters. Their bodies twitched as if they were still dashing over the snow in their dreams. Obsidian lay down on the floor by the fireplace, his sides rising and falling in a calm, steady beat. Edward lay down next to the animals with his back on the chilly stone wall. The warmth of their bodies mixed with the dim brightness of the fire that had been lit again. The manor didn't feel empty for the first time in years. Edward Harroway was not alone for the first time in years. The wind howled and shook the windows. He closed his eyes and listened to the steady heartbeat of survival, his and theirs, echoing in the dark. The dawn came in drab and slowly, with only a little bit of light getting through the frost-covered windows. Edward Harroway woke up suddenly, not sure whether he had slept at all or just floated in and out, lulled by the steady rise and fall of the breath around him. He almost thought he had dreamed the whole night, a frantic vision brought on by being alone and the never-ending storm. But as he moved on the hard floor, he heard a quiet whicker and felt the definite warmth of people close to him. He forced himself up, and every joint hurt. The old plaid blanket stuck to his shoulders, and the smell of wet horses and the faint smell of hay mixed with it. Edward took a look around the dark room. Obsidian, the black stallion, filled up half the room. He lay curled up with his big head resting between his front legs. The three yearlings were nestled together in a patchwork of old wool and burlap blankets that Edward had found in trunks and drawers. Their nostrils twitched and their ears flicked as the smell of morning, such as it was, reached them. The quietness now was the kind that comes after a lot of noise. Outside, the wind still beat against the house, but within, it was quieter, a low, steady hum that reminded them of the horrors that lay just beyond the walls. Edward rose up and stretched his sore back as he glanced around what used to be his family's stately room. Now, muddy hoofprints ruined the beautiful tiles. A few damaged picture frames and collapsed candlesticks showed how crazy things were last night. Even though the space was a mess, it felt alive, almost holy in its flaws. He proceeded slowly so as not to scare the foals. As he walked to the kitchen, his boots squelched in the half-melted snow. There was almost nothing in the pantry, a half bag of oats, some carrots that had been left out for months and were now withered, and 2 apples that had gone soft in their shell. He put the oats into an old tin bucket and felt the weight of each grain. His sensible mind told him not to use so much, but he couldn't forget the scared eyes or the thin indications of ribs under their matted coats. In the parlor, he crouched down next to the smallest yearling, a chestnut with a crooked blaze, and poured oats into his hand. The foal hesitated, looking back and forth between Edward's palm and his face. Obsidian was on guard and watched every action. Edward stayed still and whispered to him like he would to a scared child. "Take it easy now, little one. No harm done. Take what you want." The foal sniffed and licked once, then, hunger winning over fear, it nibbled Edward's hand. The soft lips, the tickling whiskers, and the eager yet gentle bite surprised him. He smiled, slowly and with some hesitation. It was a smile that made muscles he didn't know he had ache. The other 2 foals, encouraged by what they saw, moved closer, enticed by the prospect of food and care. Obsidian stayed on guard and put his huge body between Edward and the yearlings if he moved too quickly. But as Edward gave the last of the oats to the stallion, he walked forward and lowered his head to collect a handful of the grain. The interaction was silent yet strong, like a contract signed in need and trust. The manor's rooms, which used to be empty, were now filled with the subtle sounds of life, snuffling, shuffling hooves, and the crunch of oats. It was like the old home was waking up from a long, miserable sleep and taking it all in. After the feeding was done, Edward regained his strength and took care of the rest of their needs. He got buckets of water from the scullery and carried them back and forth till his arms shook. He grabbed a half bale of straw that had been left over from a delivery a long time ago and spread it out on the floor of the parlor to use as bedding. The foals rolled in it, kicking up little clouds of dust and hay. For a moment, Edward chuckled, a sound so strange in the echoing rooms that it scared him. Edward started talking to the animals as the day went on. With each hour that passed, his voice became more natural. He told them stories about his youth, fox hunts, and festivals that had been lost for a long time. He also told them the names of his ancestors whose pictures were on the walls. The horses paid attention in their own way, with their eyes following him and their ears turning when his voice went up or down. He told them about his father, who taught him how to ride and shoot, and his mother, who once brought home a hurt magpie and nursed it back to health in the same kitchen where he now made meals. He talked about loss and hope, weaving words into the fabric of the day. By the time night fell again, the mansion felt different, less like a tomb and more like a safe place. Obsidian, on the other hand, never acted up. The stallion was careful not to hurt what little was left of the Harroway legacy, even though he was big. He looked at Edward as if he were calculating the worth of the guy who had opened his door in the storm. Edward lay down on the straw next to the foals that night. The warmth of their bodies and the rhythm of their breathing made his old grief feel better. As he fell asleep, he felt something new stir, a weak sensation of belonging, a hope that maybe, even in ruin, a man and a house may still have a purpose. Outside, the snow kept falling, covering everything in quiet. But inside Harroway Manor, life, messy, wonderful life, went on, as stubborn as the sunrise. The world outside Harroway Manor had changed by daybreak. The blizzard had covered the fields in a thick blanket of snow, hiding hedgerows, fence posts that were half buried, and the final signs of the old carriageway. The trees, which were bare and thin, were covered in white, and their branches sparkled like glass in the faint winter sun. Edward could only see endless drifts from the window. The horizon was gone, and the sky and land were merged together in a frozen quiet. The cold kept coming in, pushing through the stone walls and under every door. There weren't enough supplies. Edward Harroway was just as sure of this as he was of how lonely he was. The cupboard was almost empty because he had only given the horses a few grains and apples the night before. He looked at the few wilted carrots in his hand and tried to make them into something more, but hunger was a hard truth. He couldn't give the horses what they needed. They would all starve if the storm didn't stop soon. But the foals had made it through the night, snuggled up in the straw with their sides rising and falling with slow, deep breaths. The first rays of light through the window showed the muscles under Obsidian's black coat as he stood guard. He stood by Edward's side, watching every move he made. The stallion's eyes had a weird understanding, as if they had made a deal in the storm and out of need. As Edward walked inside the house, his boots crunched on the frozen tiles. He picked up what little gear he could find, an old wool coat, a worn flat cap, and mittens that had been patched so many times that the original fabric was hardly visible. He thought about the old shotgun, but he left it by the entrance. He didn't think he'd be able to utilize it quickly if something went wrong. Food, not fighting, was what it took to stay alive. He paused at the door, feeling the cold penetrate through his clothing. He looked back at the horses and saw the warmth and life he had kept inside. He felt the weight of responsibility press against his ribs. "I'll be back," he said softly, pretty sure they understood. Obsidian flicked his ears, and one huge hoof hit the straw as if to tell Edward to keep going. The storm had calmed down, but the environment was still dangerous. It was a blinding, moving landscape where recognized landmarks disappeared under wind-carved drifts. Edward trudged through snow that was up to his knees, and every step was a fight against tiredness. His breath hung in the air, freezing on his beard and lashes. The wind cut through him and froze his lungs. He walked to the thicket at the edge of the old fields, where he knew that rabbits sometimes made their homes in the winter. As he walked, memories followed him. The Harroway crest, which used to be proudly hung over the fireplace, is now covered in dust and cobwebs. The land that had been in his family for generations was sold off piece by piece until only the manor and a little piece of field were left. He heard his father's voice in the strong wind, severe and dissatisfied, reminding him of the legacy he had failed to keep. A Harroway never gives up their land. Edward shook his head, determined to get above the shame and guilt and focus on the job at hand. His fingers were numb, but he was able to rig up a basic snare at the base of a bramble bush and bait it with one of his remaining shriveled carrots. He waited behind a stone wall for what felt like hours, urging his body not to tremble or give in to the cold. The empty white silence made time stretch and fold. Finally, something moved, a flash of brown fur that was quick and careful. Edward held his breath. The bait worked on the rabbit. The snare closed. He felt both relief and regret as he killed the beast with shaking hands. He had never liked killing, but he knew that being kind and living didn't always go hand in hand. He walked slowly back to the mansion, stopping only to pick up the few bits of dry grass and rags he could find in the barn that was falling down. His legs felt heavy and his heart was racing by the time he got to the front steps. It had begun to snow again, a fine, bitter powder. The sky was getting darker. Edward staggered up the steps, holding his lute, and pounded on the door. He thought for a second that he might not make it inside before he fell. He remembered his father, who was proud and strong, and the shepherd who had saved him all those years before. This made him think that every life was a succession of debts paid and owing. When he got inside, he didn't feel welcome. Instead, he felt a wall. Obsidian was in the way of the fire, and the stallion's massive body was in the way. Edward halted, and his breathing came in short bursts. "It's me," he said with a gulp. "Let me go." For a nervous second, he thought Obsidian may betray him and decide that a weak guy wasn't worth trusting anymore. But suddenly the stallion lowered his head and stepped aside in a slow, almost royal way, letting the other horse pass. Edward understood the gesture: permission, respect, and a weak link. He fell to his knees next to the fire and let the rabbit drop to the floor. The foals moved around in the straw and looked at him. Edward worked fast, skinning and cleaning the rabbit with hard fingers. The smell of the meat roasting over the open flame filled the room. He left the nicest scraps for the horses and mixed the rest with some straw for the foals. Obsidian watched everything with his eyes on Edward's face. The flickering firelight made the chamber feel almost alive again. It wasn't a ruined manor. It was a shelter, a place where hope still lived. Edward sat next to the stallion as night descended again. He could feel the huge lungs rise and fall against his back. He let himself hope for the first time, not for the old life to come back, but for the possibility to make something new out of the ashes. Outside, the snow piled up further against the door. Inside, though, man and beast stayed awake together, a weak alliance against the dark. The storm showed no signs of letting up, and the whole world fell silent. The pale ribbons of light that came through the frostbitten windows were weak and timid, as if they didn't want to show how bad the ancient mansion was. Edward Harroway's back hurt when he woke up because it was cold and there was straw on it. For a long time, he just listened. He heard the horses' steady breathing and the little noises of movement as the yearlings moved around. He thought it was strange how quickly he got used to not being alone. He thought he could hear the home sighing in relief, happy to have company after so many years of being vacant. He got up, pulled the worn cloak tightly around his shoulders, and squatted down next to the foals. When he touched them, their eyes opened. They trusted him but were still scared, as if they weren't sure if this fragile calm would continue. Edward used his fingers to comb through their messy manes, getting rid of straw and talking to them as he worked. "You're secure here," he said, but maybe he was just trying to calm himself down as much as the animals. There weren't enough supplies. He cut the last apple into 3 pieces for the foals, making sure to do it perfectly and giving each piece out if it was a gold coin. The smallest foal, who was also the shyest of the 3, took a chunk right from his hand. Its tongue was warm and scratchy on his flesh. Edward grinned without meaning to. It was the first real smile he'd had in years. It felt strange to stretch his cheeks, but yet natural, as if his muscles recalled how to be happy even while his head had forgotten. Obsidian stood close and watched the ceremony take place. The stallion was fidgety and scraped his hooves on the floor, but he didn't get in the way. Obsidian's ears flashed and his body tensed every time Edward got too close to the yearlings. He wasn't threatening, but he was nervous and protective, as if he had a burden heavier than hunger. Edward talked out loud more than ever that morning, when the wind howled outside. At first, his stories were brief and rambling. Then they got longer and included strange recollections that had been sitting in his mind's attic for a long time. He told a story about how, when he was a youngster, he had tried to sneak a lamb into the manor's kitchen, but it broke a vase and made a mess of the flour. He talked about how his mother's laughing was as bright as the sun in the spring and how the estate used to be full of life until it all went away. The horses listened in their own way, with big, bright eyes and heads cocked. They would sometimes nip or snort, as if they were expressing their own thoughts. At that moment, Edward knew that the loneliness that had been bothering him for years was starting to go away, slowly and quietly like snow melting. The horses' breathing and the quiet sound of their hooves shuffling made a type of symphony that filled the spaces with warmth. He even caught himself singing a song from when he was a kid, when he scrubbed the floor and put old hay and wet straw by the door to throw away later. Edward made tea after he fed the horses. It was the weak, clear kind that didn't really deserve the term. He sat on the old hearth and held the mug between his hands to keep warm while he watched the fire flicker. The house was quiet for the first time in years, but it wasn't too quiet. He started talking to Obsidian like the stallion was a friend instead of a savage animal. "You're not simply a story out there, are you?" he thought, his voice low and steady. "You are a protector. You brought them here. Or maybe you needed refuge just as much as I did." Obsidian moved his tail and tilted his head as if he were thinking about the question. The weather got better enough by noon for Edward to open a window and let in a breath of fresh air. The foals moved around, their little noses pressed against the draft, sniffing the world outside the manor. Edward let himself hope that once the storm finally stopped, he would be able to get more supplies or at least find some more food for the horses. As the day turned into night, something seemed to alter in the room. The tiniest yearling, a chestnut filly, walked up to Edward. At first, she was shy, but then she got brave. She poked his knee to see if he had a treat. He held out his empty palm, but she still nuzzled it. "Sorry, sweetheart. That's it for today." The filly stayed with him, cuddling up next to him. The other two followed in, pushing close together and giving out a little warmth. Edward stayed there for a long time with his hands on their backs, feeling their heartbeats thrum under his fingertips. Obsidian gazed from his corner, his eyes black and bright. As night fell, Edward lit a few ancient candles, which made the mansion glow with gold. He reclined on the floor next to the foals and allowed his tiredness draw him down. He muttered before he fell asleep, "I promise nothing bad will happen to you." He wasn't sure if he was making a promise to the horses, to himself, or to the ghosts of everyone he had lost. But as he fell asleep, surrounded by warmth, breath, and the soft presence of living creatures, Edward felt something inside him start to melt, a small, bright spark of trust that he had both given and received, shining defiantly against the dark. Night in Harroway Manor pressed in, heavier and deeper than it had before. Edward slept fitfully, stuck between being tired and worried. He had a dream that he was a youngster again, running around in the summer meadows with the sun shining on his skin. Then the light went out, and the cold air of winter took its place. He woke up with a jolt, his heart racing. He didn't know where he was for a second, only that something was different. Obsidian stood beside the door, his nostrils blazing and his muscles tight like pulled wire. The stallion's bulk made a big, moving shadow in the room. His ears were pointed toward the hall. The yearlings pushed up against Edward and shook. Somewhere, a thump and then the distinct crunch of boots on compacted snow rang through the manor's thick stone walls. Edward pushed himself up, and all of his senses were acute. He grabbed the old shotgun that was leaning beside the fireplace and held it tightly, even though he wasn't sure it would help. The horses could see he was scared, so they got quiet and tight. The storm had calmed down, but a new kind of danger was creeping down the dark halls. A fist hit the front door hard, making another noise. It wasn't the frantic knocking of someone who was lost in the storm. It was the weighty, methodical demand of a guy who thought he would get an answer. Edward's lungs were frozen. For years, no one came to Harroway Manor without an invitation. He got up gently, putting a soothing hand on the neck of the smallest yearling, and walked along the drafty hallway. Obsidian followed him step for step, a living wall of muscle and instinct at his side. As they got closer to the door, the smell of horses and smoke got stronger, along with something sharper, expensive cologne that Edward hadn't smelled since he was a kid. Edward stopped at the door. His reflection in the bent glass looked like a ghost, a pale face, unkempt hair, and eyes that seemed like they hadn't slept in days. He squared his shoulders and pulled up the clasp. The wind blew the door open, and a tall, broad-shouldered guy stood in the icy yard. Lord Percival Ashcombe strode over the threshold without waiting to be invited. He was wearing a dark wool coat that must have cost more than all of Edward's food. His cool, piercing eyes scanned the entrance, missing nothing. "Good evening, Harroway. You hang up with weird people these days." Edward held the shotgun tighter and made himself speak calmly. "What makes you come out in this weather, Ashcom?" Ashcombe grinned a little and shut the door behind him with a gloved hand. He walked with the comfortable swagger of someone who has always thought the world would do what he wanted. There were tracks in the snow. Big tracks. "I thought I'd come see what kind of guests you were having." Before Edward could say anything, Obsidian showed up in the corridor and blocked Ashcombe's route with his huge body. The stallion's head was down and its ears were flat. Ashcombe stopped, his eyes narrowing, then widening as he realized what was going on. "Well, I'll be darned. That's him, right? The Black Ghost. Obsidian himself." Edward didn't say anything. His quiet was enough. Ashcombe moved forward, not caring about the stallion's warning. He looked from Obsidian to the yearlings gathered in the corner of the parlor and then back to Edward. "A very good find. I heard that a black stallion was roaming about with foals. I believe that was simply drunken talk. But here you are, taking care of half of Yorkshire's legends in your home." Edward's expression was blank, but his heart was racing. He had always known that the world would come to take what little he still cared about. "They came to me," he murmured in a low voice. "Just as you did." Ashcombe smiled more, but it wasn't a friendly smile. "And what are you going to do with them? Harroway, you can hardly feed yourself." These animals should be in a stable, not wasting away in an old drafty house. The sound of Obsidian stamping his hoof echoed through the stone. Ashcom looked at the shotgun and then looked at Edward, whose ice-blue eyes were burning into him. You know I could take them off your hands. Find them good places to live. Even get a fair price. Or the law could come by. Trespassing, stealing, or putting animals at risk would cost you everything very quickly. The threat was in the air, bigger than the storm. Edward's knuckles turned white as he tightened his grasp on the rifle. You can't buy them. Ashcombe shrugged and brushed a piece of snow off his sleeve. Do what you want. But let's not act like you can last forever. I'll be back. And the next time, I won't be by myself. He stopped at the entrance and turned around. Harroway, you should ask yourself if you're the kind of man who saves strays or the kind of man who knows when to cut his losses. Ashcombe left without waiting for an answer, his boots crunching on the snow. Edward shut the door, his heart racing and his shoulders drooping with anxiety and tiredness. Obsidian stayed by his side, head up, and eyes on the empty blackness outside. For a long time, neither the man nor the horse moved. Then, slowly, the yearlings moved up to Edward and pressed against his legs. He knelt down and wrapped his arms around them, feeling how fragile hope was when it was so close. Obsidian dropped his head until it touched Edward's shoulder. It was a whispered promise amid the quiet. They would confront whatever storm was coming together. Edward Harroway finally understood in the echoing solitude of the manor. Sometimes, what you risk is all that confirms you are still alive. It was like the manor was holding its breath after Lord Ashcombe left. The shutters shook in the wind, but inside it was quiet and brittle, which didn't help, it just made every sound sharper. That night, Edward didn't sleep. He sat by the embers, watching the flames dance with his shotgun close by. Obsidian stood in the shadows, silent. He jumped every time the wind moaned or a branch tapped on a window, thinking that boots would clatter and lawmen would break down his door. The storm had finally run its course by daybreak. Gray daybreak showed the outside world covered in an eerie quiet, with the snow laying deep and undisturbed but for Ashcombe's tracks leaving. But within the manor, the air was thick with fear, as if the menace had gotten into the walls. Edward quietly fed the horses, giving each of the 3 yearlings and Obsidian a handful of oats. The foals pushed at him, hungry but trusting. He watched them feed, every move planned, trying to remember their faces, the shape of a muzzle, the white spot on one filly's forehead, and the way their delicate legs shook as they learned what safety meant. He tried not to think about what would happen if Ashcombe came back with men, the law, or something worse. But the truth stuck to him like a second skin. He was no longer merely a lonely guy who had nothing to lose. He was now a guardian, for as long as his bravery, or fate, could hold up against the coming storm. Around noon, a loud knock echoed through the house. It wasn't hesitant, it was firm. Edward's breath caught. He looked at Obsidian, who had already turned to face the noise, his muscles tense. Edward walked up to the door with the shotgun in his hand and looked through the crack in the curtain. Ashcombe stood there, his winter coat spotless and a mischievous look on his face. But this time, he wasn't by himself. 2 men stood next to him. One was a big stable hand Edward knew from the estate next door, and the other was a grim-faced constable in a blue uniform with his man on his holster. Edward opened the door just a crack, enough for his voice to come out but not his dread. Lord Ashcombe, you're back so soon. Ashcombe's smile got bigger, and his teeth were sharp like a wolf's. Harroway, I told you I'd be back. I keep my promises. The officer walked forward, standing straight and looking authoritative. There have been complaints, sir, of animals being stolen. And some worry about the well-being of animals. Ashcombe interrupted, his voice dripping with fake worry. It's a cold winter, constable. These animals shouldn't be here, living in a house with no heat. I'm giving them better care. It's really the right thing to do. Edward's hand shook behind the door, but his voice was calm. They came to me for help. They aren't in pain, at least not while I'm alive. The constable hesitated, his eyes darting past Edward to the huge black stallion standing behind him. Obsidian's presence filled the hallway, and his nose flared as his eyes narrowed in a silent warning. The stable hand moved his weight about, which was plainly making him nervous. Ashcombe took advantage of the situation, his voice low and threatening. Edward, you don't stand a chance. You don't have any food, money, or time. We should take the horses, Obsidian, and the yearlings. I promise you that I will put them in the right spot. Edward's wrath eventually boiled over, intense and quick. Your word means nothing here. You only care about making money, not about people's lives. Ashcombe's eyes got smaller. Be fair. What good is all this pain for something that won't work? Edward raised the shotgun, pointing the barrel low but steady. If you want them, you'll have to step over me. Ashcombe's smile went away. For a time, the air was full of the threat of violence. The constable came in between them and raised his voice. Men, don't cause any trouble. You say the animals are fine, Mr. Harroway. Can I come in and see for myself? Edward nodded and let the constable go by, but he kept an eye on Ashcombe and the stable hand. The police officer proceeded slowly, looking around the parlor where the foals were lying on straw, with Obsidian standing guard. He knelt down next to the yearlings and stroked their necks gently. They look peaceful enough, even though they're thin. This one still has some sheen in her coat. How did you get them? Edward looked him in the eye. They found me, not the other way around. I did what I could. Look at them now if you want proof. For a long time, the constable looked at him before nodding. I will write a report, but I don't see any cruelty here. Just a guy trying to make ends meet. Ashcombe was angry and his voice got louder. That's not enough. These animals are worth something. You know how much Obsidian is worth. You let a ruin like this retain him? The lawman turned around, his voice flat. He hasn't done anything illegal. Not yet. Ashcombe's face twisted in rage. Harroway, you'll regret this. There are some things that the law can't protect you from. Edward stared him down, and the years of shame and despair faded away, leaving behind a fresh, uncompromising dignity. Maybe not, he murmured softly. But I can keep them safe as long as I stand. Ashcombe stayed for a while, looking back and forth between Edward, Obsidian, and the shaking foals, as if he were looking for a way to get through the weak shield they had made together. Finally, though, he turned, and his troops followed him, their boots crunching on the ice step. When the door closed, Edward's knees gave out, and he felt tired after all the adrenaline. Obsidian came forward and gently pushed him, and Edward laughed, albeit it was a rough chuckle. We did it, he said quietly. For the time being. As the light faded and Ashcombe's threat echoed in the distance, Edward Harroway stood straighter than he had in years. He was a man with something to protect and a reason to hope. That night, the manor became quite quiet and tense. Edward attempted to sleep, but every creak in the rafters and every sigh of wind against the window made him sit up straight, thinking Ashcombe would come back or the policeman would change his mind. The horses seemed nervous too, moving about on their straw and twitching their ears to sounds that only they could hear. But the dawn came with an unexpected softness, as a soft golden light spread over the icy fields. Edward knew better than to think that the world outside looked clean. He had seen too much to believe what he saw. He let himself feel a moment of weak thankfulness as he made tea in the kitchen and watered down the remainder of the leaves. The foals were awake and cuddled up close, their breath making the cold air foggy. Obsidian stood guard, his eyes gentle in the quiet of the dawn. Edward sipped his tea and looked out the frosty window. It was then that he saw movement. At first, it was just a flicker, but then a figure came out of the trees, wrapped in a worn-out coat. Edward's heart skipped a beat. He put down his drink and ran to the door, leaving his shotgun beside the fireplace. The figure got closer, and it was a bent-over man plodding through the snow with a worn-out rucksack on one shoulder. He stopped at the gate, looked at the mansion, and then pounded. It was a sharp, rhythmic knock that seemed eerily familiar. Edward opened the door a little. "Who's there?" He pulled down his scarf, and his face was thin and aged, but his brilliant eyes still had a trace of mischief in them. "Edward, you look like a sight for sore eyes. Or maybe it's just a sore sight." Edward's throat got tight. "Thomas? Who is Thomas Whitlock?" The man smiled. "In the flesh, but not much of it left." Edward laughed, shocked and not believing it. He opened the door wide and dragged his old friend in, patting him on the back. For a moment, it felt like the years had disappeared and they were both young guys again, sneaking whiskey into the stables and telling stories after dark. But the sensation passed when Thomas looked around at the bizarre scene. The foals were sleeping in the parlor, and Obsidian was watching him carefully from the hearth. "You have company," Thomas murmured softly. Edward nodded, and for the first time in weeks, the tension in his chest went away. "I couldn't get them out. They needed me." Thomas knelt down and held out his hand to the youngest foal. The filly sniffed his fingers and then nuzzled into his palm. "Animals that are smart. They found an obstinate fool with a kind heart." Edward snorted, feeling ashamed. "Don't even think about it. Thomas stood and looked at the empty pantry and the small form of his old friend. "Ed, you need help. Word is out that Ashcombe is looking for something valuable. I thought you would be the only one who could stop him." Edward's jaw got tight. "He wants the foals and obsidian. Says I can't take care of them. He says he'll come back with the law or something worse." Thomas looked at the door and then back at Edward. "Then you will need more than just being stubborn. I brought what I could, some oats, some salted pork, and some old equipment from my shed." Edward felt tears welling up in his eyes, but he blinked them away. "I'm not sure how to thank you." "Don't. You hired me when no one else would. You were there for my family when my wife got sick. That's the kind of stuff that sticks in a man's mind." They all worked together to bring Thomas's stuff inside. The horses got the oats first. Obsidian ate from Thomas's hand, looked him over, and then nodded once to show that he was okay with him. Edward and Thomas may share the pork with thin potatoes. The room felt warmer and the air felt less thick for the first time in days. The foals even looked happier as they pranced around in awkward circles after eating. Thomas started to restore what he could. He used old rags to patch shattered window panes and wood to support the doors. He moved with the steady hands of someone who had done a lot of hard work before, humming as he worked. Edward did what he could to help, but most of the time he just observed, feeling a sense of comfort growing inside him. It looked like they would be able to make it through the winter for the first time, and that not everything was against them. That night, Thomas sat by the fire and carved a rough tiny horse out of a piece of wood for the smallest foal to play with. Edward took care of Obsidian by stroking his coat and saying thank you in a low voice. "He's a good animal," Thomas said as he looked over. "Not just excellent, but amazing. People claim that Obsidian was made for kings. Are you sure you're ready to fight Ashcombe for him?" Edward glanced at the stallion and the yearlings, who were all asleep with their legs tangled together and their dreams. "Thomas, I lost everything else. The property, the family, and the past. I won't lose them either. Not while I can stand up." Thomas nodded, and his eyes said that he agreed. "Then you're not by alone anymore. I'll come back tomorrow and bring what I can. Maybe wake up a few other people who remember what Harroway used to mean." Edward's throat clenched as pride and humility fought inside him. He only got a quiet "Thank you" before going to the fire. That night, as the wind picked up again, Edward reclined in the warmth of horses and the hope of making new friends. He believed for the first time since the world had become gray that hope would slowly and stubbornly come back. He knew, nevertheless, that Ashcombe would not give up. The real test was still to come. But Edward Harroway was no longer fighting by himself. The next morning, the snow fell lightly, drifting in slow circles past the broken windows of the mansion. The world seemed different inside. Edward woke up early, sore but alive, and for once, he didn't feel the typical weight of fear on his chest. He didn't feel excited, but he did feel a little ready for whatever the day would bring. Thomas had departed at morning, saying he would be back before dark with additional supplies and, if he was lucky, another set of willing hands. Edward walked quietly through the old house, being cautious not to wake the horses or break the stillness that hung in the air. The yearlings slept soundly in a nest of straw and old comforters, all knotted up. Obsidian stood over them, always on the lookout, with his ears snapping toward every sound. Edward made the best meal he could, a piece of salted pork and a heel of stale bread. He then shared it with the horses, giving each one a handful of oats. The youngest foal, a chestnut filly with a crooked blaze, ate from his palm again, her tongue warm and hungry. Edward massaged her neck and thought about how much she trusted him and how quickly their lives had become connected. The day went by slowly. Edward spent the morning fixing the doors and windows, feeling better with every little thing he did, like putting a new plank here and stuffing a draft with rags there. He started humming again, a song from his youth that he could barely remember. The horses appeared to like the sound. Even though the manor was falling apart, it didn't feel like a ruin. It felt rather like a place where life was strong enough to stay. The sun came out from behind the clouds for the first time in weeks about noon. Light came into the room and lit up the dust motes that were spinning over the foals as they played. Edward watched as they chased each other in silly, happy circles, their slender legs steadying and their spirits increasing. Obsidian stood at the edge of the light and looked at Edward. The stallion came closer, but not too quickly. Edward stood upright, not sure what the big black horse wanted. Obsidian stopped a step away, dropped his huge head, and flared his nostrils. The two looked at one another without saying a word. Edward realized the animal's eyes were full of intellect, which made him feel the weight of choice and judgment. Obsidian then bent his forelegs and bowed slowly and carefully. It was not the scared stoop of a beaten animal, but the serious bow of a king to someone of equal rank. Edward felt his throat shut because the gesture was so unexpected and polite. Overcome, he collapsed on his knees in the straw. Obsidian held the bow for a long time, then stood up straight and stepped forward, gently pushing his muzzle against Edward's shoulder. Edward couldn't talk, so he put his arms around the horse's broad neck. He cried for the first time in years, not because of what he had lost, but because of what he had found. "I'm not alone," he muttered, his voice breaking in the still chamber. "Not anymore." The yearlings flocked around him, their bodies warm against his flanks, as they sensed the change. Edward sat with them, stroking their coats and inhaling in the smell of earth and hay, life and hope. Time seemed to stop for a while, and the anxieties of the world were kept at bay by the simple act of accepting. Later, when the sun went down, Edward sat next to the fire and thought about things. He told Obsidian stories and shared the dreams he had kept hidden for so long in a quiet voice. "Not because you walked onto my land, but because you chose to stay, I dubbed you neighbor. You could have left, but you stayed. You are not a trophy or a prize. You're my buddy." Obsidian listened, his ears twitching at Edward's words and his eyes sparkling in the firelight. The foals slept nearby, finally happy. Outside, the snow began to fall again, softly and without stopping. The world beyond the manor was still unknown. Ashcombe's warning still hung in the air, casting a shadow over every tranquil moment. But something unshakable had taken hold inside. Edward and Obsidian's link was no longer just one of need, it was now one of choice and respect. As night fell, the old walls of the manor seemed to lean in, protecting their weak community. Edward thought about what the future may hold. Would Ashcombe come back? Would the legislation get tougher? Would the storms ever stop? He didn't have any answers, but for the first time in years, he wasn't afraid to face the questions. The night came on, and it was very quiet. Obsidian stood by the window and watched the snow fall. His breath was fogging up the frigid air. Edward lay down in the straw, and the foals crowded around him. Before he fell asleep, he held out his hand, and Obsidian nuzzled it softly. The promise they made to each other was stronger than any words. Edward Harroway would not have to confront any storms alone that were still waiting in the dark. In the damaged heart of Yorkshire, loyalty had come to stay. The morning came gently, with faint light coming through holes in the boarded windows and drawing silver stripes across the worn floor. Edward Harroway woke up from a sleep without dreams, with horses all about him. The yearlings were lying on his knees and chest, breathing slowly and deeply. Obsidian was only a few feet away, looking out the window and turning his ears to the faint noises of a world waking up. The storm has finally stopped. The sky was a clear, pale blue for the first time in weeks, and it stretched wide over the hills. The fresh snow covered all of Yorkshire in a thick blanket, with only a single set of boot tracks leading up to the manor's front door. Edward sat up carefully, being cautious not to wake the foals, and let the quiet of the morning settle over him. He moved softly, placing the rest of the tea leaves into a pot that was already broken. Then he boiled the tiny bit of water he had left on the stove. He cut a heel of bread with a knife that had been used for years and was very thin. He gave the foals the crumbs and kept the crust for himself. There wasn't much food, but it seemed like a feast. He poured a little bit of tea into a tin mug and laid it on the cool hearth. He liked the subtle, bitter smell. Obsidian crossed the parlor in silently, poking Edward's shoulder with his big, dark snout when he felt the mood change. Edward grinned and scratched the stallion's neck, amazed once more at how much trust had formed between them. "We made it," he muttered, his voice raspy with thanks. "We're still alive." Soon, Thomas's knock on the door sounded familiar. Edward rushed to let him in, and his face lit up with relief. Thomas's arms were full with things: sacks of oats, bundles of hay, a slab of bacon wrapped in old fabric, and a sack of potatoes hanging from his shoulder. His cheeks were red from the cold, and his eyes were bright with happiness. He smiled and said, "I brought what I promised. And I have more coming. People in the village still know what the Harroway name used to mean. I told them you had stood up to Ashcombe. Some of them want to help." Edward blinked in shock. He had thought for so long that no one remembered him that the thought of neighbors helping him seemed impossible. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice shaking with relief and disbelief. "Really?" Thomas waved him away and got to work unloading supplies. "Ed, you've given people something to believe in again. It could be more than simply this old house or these horses. It's about not letting folks like Ashcombe believe they own everything that matters. They fed the animals together, and the room was full with laughter and peaceful talk. The yearlings nickered and prodded for oats, while Obsidian calmly ate from Edward's hand. As time went on, the darkness within the manor faded a little more, replaced by warmth and the soothing sound of doing tasks with a friend. Edward went outside later, when the sun was higher in the sky. The environment was a bright white, and the air was clean and keen. He looked out over the fields, his fields, covered in light and silence. The only sign of life for miles around was the smoke coming from the manor's chimney. Edward felt a brief surge of ancient pride in his chest. He was still up. Maybe the land, the manor, and the legacy weren't all lost after all. When he went back inside, he shook the snow off his boots and saw Thomas putting another log on the fire. "Do you think Ashcombe will give up now?" Thomas asked, trying to keep his tone calm. Edward shrugged his shoulders. "Maybe. Or he might try again when the snow melts and the roads are clean. But it doesn't matter. We are finally ready for him. Not just you, not just me, everyone." Thomas smiled, and there was a hint of mischief in his eyes. "That's the Harroway I remember." The rest of the day was spent working in silence. They fixed a broken hinge, cleaned the hallway, and made temporary beds for the horses in what used to be the great dining room. At night, the manor was lit by candles and smelled like burning wood. The animals slept close together, their sides rising and falling in the quiet of a home they had gotten back. Edward was in the kitchen pouring another cup of tea when he saw Obsidian walk up to the window and look out into the night. Soft and limitless snow floated by. Edward joined the stallion and put a hand on its strong neck. He could feel the steady thrum of life beneath the smooth coat. "We'll get through this winter," he said in a calm voice, making a commitment. "And no matter what happens next, we'll deal with it together." Obsidian puffed softly, as if he agreed, and for a long time, the man and horse stood shoulder to shoulder, two survivors finding meaning in each other's presence. As the candles burnt down, Edward sat by the fire with the young horses and told them stories about the past, of losing hope and then finding it again. Thomas smiled as he listened, and in that golden light, the mansion appeared to come alive. Edward Harroway felt at home for the first time in years. It wasn't because the house was intact, the land was his, or the future was guaranteed. It was because he had found something deeper. Friendship, loyalty, and the strength to go on. The outside world might still be cold and scary, but something permanent had taken root inside the old house. He closed his eyes and allowed the noises and feel of his small, stubborn family wash over him like a benediction. He muttered, "We'll see another spring. We'll look at it together." And when the wind blew over the manor, Edward believed it, not as a wish, but as a silent, unyielding truth.